Cersei Lannister stood at the highest window of Maegor's Holdfast, gazing over the sprawling city of King's Landing. Her fingers were folded around the windowsill, the cool stone grounding her in a rare moment of anticipation. The sun was low in the sky, casting a hazy amber light over the rooftops, and the stained glass windows of the Great September of Baelor seemed to catch and hold every last ounce of that waning brilliance. She narrowed her eyes against the glow, surveying the distant crowd of worshippers who knelt upon the steps leading into the September. Once, the sight of these masses might have annoyed her, their piety and subservience a nuisance to her pride. Now, however, Cersei's lips curved into a faint, secret smile. She turned away from the window, letting the heavy drapery fall back into place. The court was hushed these days, her courtiers careful with their words and glances. The king, her son, had become a near-silent observer on the Iron Throne, and the small council seemed to revolve around her whims more than it ever had. The Red Keep was quieter in a sense, the atmosphere heavy with fear of the Faith militants' authority. Yet in this hush, Cersei thrived. Before, every word uttered in the keep had to be weighed against the power of the Tyrells, the cunning of Varys, the whispered rumors about dragons across the narrow sea. Now, she and her unexpected ally, the High Sparrow, reigned in a delicate balance of secular and religious power. She recalled the earliest days of the High Sparrow's ascendancy, how she had once tried to manipulate his fanaticism for her own gain. He had imprisoned Margaery Tyrell and Loras, tightening his grip on the city through moral zeal. At first, Cersei had expected to play him like a pawn, but she had underestimated both his intelligence and his convictions. She had paid dearly for her pride, enduring that humiliating walk of atonement. And yet that ordeal had awakened a more potent part of her. The scornful eyes of the populace, the cold streets that cut her feet, and the stench of rotten produce hurled her way had whittled her hatred into something sharp and focused. She could not bring back the child she had lost, her sweet Myrcella, and she could never wash away the memory of that utter humiliation. But she could mold the future to her liking. She could harness that rage, that thirst for vengeance, and shape it into a sword. For a time, she had hated the High Sparrow with every fiber of her being, fantasizing about crushing him, about razing the Great September of Baelor to the ground. But in their endless battle of wills, each had found something strangely similar in the other, an unbreakable determination. One sought to cleanse the world of its sins. The other wished to see that world purified of her enemies. Over the course of uneasy negotiations, they had discovered a single common goal, a place of safety, order, and power for themselves. It had taken a precarious dance of threats, confessions, and mutual respect before they finally chose to join forces. His devotion and vast following merged with her cunning and political might. They had become an alliance that would reshape the Seven Kingdoms. In one bold stroke, Cersei had agreed to champion the faith, restoring many of the ancient privileges that had once belonged to the faith militant, awarding them far-reaching influence and the power to judge not only moral crimes but also high treason in the eyes of the realm. In return, the faith pledged its unwavering support to House Lannister and Cersei's son, King Tommen. They had driven the Tyrells from King's Landing in a blinding torrent of arrests and accusations, publicly disgraced for alleged moral failings, corruption, and heresy. The people, swayed by the High Sparrow's austere presence and relentless preaching, clamored for justice. Cersei savored every moment when the great House Tyrell, which had once threatened to overshadow her, crumbled under the relentless assault. But that was just the beginning. Her footsteps echoed against the polished floors as she made her way toward the private audience chamber where she would soon meet with the High Sparrow. The faith had quarters in the Red Keep now, ironically housed in some of the same luxurious rooms that once served as lodging for visiting nobles. The difference was that the High Sparrow's retinue had stripped away every hint of ornamentation. Gold and silver candelabras were replaced with simple iron. Tapestries bearing the Lannister lion were removed, replaced by plain cloth or left as bare stone. Where once servants scurried to and fro with sweet pastries and fine wines, now only water or thin gruel was offered to the devout. The transformation always jarred newcomers, though Cersei had grown used to it. She did not care about those trivial comforts that had once been her pride. Her thirst these days was for dominion, not indulgence. A pair of Faith militant members stood outside the chamber doors, each bearing the star-shaped scar upon their foreheads. They bowed their heads as Cersei approached. She acknowledged them with a cold nod, then entered the room. The High Sparrow was there already, seated at a plain wooden table with a single candle flickering by his side. Papers were spread before him. Letters of confession, testimonies of alleged sins, lists of those who might be judged. She wondered how much of his time he actually spent reading them, or whether he had a dedicated network of fanatics who fed him the crucial facts. He raised his eyes as she closed the door, and though his face remained reserved, he offered her a small but courteous tilt of his head. "Your Grace," he said softly. He did not stand. It was not an act of overt disrespect. He was old, and he was the High Sparrow, a man whose authority under the faith rivaled even a queen's. In their alliance, they had learned not to haggle too much over such gestures. Cersei regarded him in silence for a moment, letting her gaze flick over the papers. "We have much to discuss," she said. "Important decisions to be made about the houses that still resist our righteous cause." The High Sparrow folded his hands on the table, his sleeves rough and tattered. "We do. The lords of the realm must know that King Tommen is God's chosen representative. To question him is to question the will of the Seven. But we must proceed carefully, Your Grace." She approached the table, resting a hand on one of the piles of parchment. "Care has its place," she replied, "but boldness is what won us victory over House Tyrell. It will guide us again when dealing with the rest." He watched her, his eyes veiled with thought. "We must ensure that each house we bring low is undone by its own sins, uncovered by the faith. Our cause is pure. We must maintain that purity in the eyes of the small folk." Cersei's jaw tightened, though her expression remained confident. "I will ensure the people understand that the realm cannot tolerate treachery. If a house stands in defiance, I want them removed root and stem." The High Sparrow inclined his head. Justice must be done. And so it was decided. Their alliance would systematically strike against all the great houses of Westeros that stood in the way. Some would be accused of heresy, others of moral failings that outraged the faith. Men and women who had once governed with impunity would now find themselves under merciless scrutiny. The new power dynamic in King's Landing was mercurial and dangerous, with every rumor feeding the faith militant, fueling arrests, and leading to fervent confessions coaxed under the watchful eyes of the devout. For Cersei, it was a triumph long in the making. In the weeks that followed, a slow but steady wave of accusations rippled across the realm. Raven after raven left the Red Keep, each carrying official charges against lords and ladies whose loyalty was in doubt. While some of these accusations were built upon the flimsiest whispers of impropriety, the High Sparrow's unwavering conviction gave them weight. The masses believed that the Seven guided his hand, that these men and women had to be guilty if the faith denounced them. Cersei's old champion, Qyburn, whispered in her ear that the paranoia taking root among the lords could be exploited further. He had his own network of little birds now that Varys was gone. Their intelligence guided many of the accusations, though no one beyond Cersei, Qyburn, and the High Sparrow's inner circle knew the extent of these manipulations. House Martell and Dorne had already been half in chaos after the death of Prince Doran and the coup staged by Ilaria Sand. Cersei had not forgotten Myrcella's murder, a wound so deep it ached in her dreams. With the High Sparrow's help, she declared that Dorne was harboring heretics who had conspired to bring about a regicidal war. The faith militant accompanied royal forces south, crossing the Dornish marches with surprising swiftness. Along the way, they rallied discontented local houses who had once chafed under Martell rule. Dorne was fractious enough that the appearance of the faith's righteous cause lit the region's simmering tensions ablaze. Even in the sweltering sun of the Dornish deserts, robed priests preached from wagons, proclaiming the sins of House Martell. They told stories of murder, adulterous behavior, savage violence, all combined with godless rebellion. Many small folk, weary of the power struggles that had plagued their region, listened. Some rebelled against their overlords. When the Faith militant finally reached Sunspear, the city was in a state of near riot. The sand snakes had vanished into the labyrinthine deserts and mountains, but Ilaria Sand had tried to hold the palace with a small band of loyalists. She was given no mercy when the city's gates were flung open by those who believed the faith and the crown would restore stability. Cersei did not bother to attend the final reckoning in Sunspear. She had more pressing matters in King's Landing, but she made certain to have a raven deliver the news of Ilaria Sand's capture personally to her. The High Sparrow's formal condemnation arrived alongside it. Ilaria and her followers were to be tried for murder, sedition, and blasphemy. The trial was swift, with no one doubting the verdict. Cersei insisted the trial be held in the Great September of Baelor itself, with Tommen seated on his throne nearby, to demonstrate that both crown and faith stood as one. The Sand faction was found guilty. The method of execution was left to the king. Tommen, uncertain and fearful, looked toward his mother. She let her cool green gaze rest on him until, with trembling lips, he nodded his assent to the faith's recommendation. Execution within the Sept's courtyard, a spectacle for all to see. When Ilaria Sand was marched out, her chains clanking, the small folk gathered by the thousands. They howled for justice or for blood or both. The High Sparrow led them in prayer, and the throng repeated his pious words. Ilaria tried to speak, to shout something about Cersei's hypocrisy, about how Cersei had fathered children with her own brother, and about the monstrous conditions that truly governed King's Landing. But no one would listen. The Faith militant pressed spears to her throat, silencing her cries. The city cheered as the blade fell, and Cersei stood at a high balcony, watching. She felt nothing akin to sorrow or regret. There was only a thin wash of satisfaction. That same day, the Faith declared Dorne cleansed of corruption but placed under guided administration, meaning a trusted governor was installed under King Tommen's authority, with local religious leaders ensuring the region's morality. In practice, it amounted to a near occupation by the Crown and the Faith militant. Still, the unrest began to subside as the newly installed powers distributed food, enacted public prayers, and punished dissenters ruthlessly. Emboldened by the victory in Dorne, Cersei set her eyes next on the Vale. Little Robert Arryn was still Lord Paramount, a sickly boy easily manipulated by those around him. His mother, Lisa Tully, had died years ago, and Peter Baelish, Littlefinger, had once held the region in his cunning grasp. But in this new era, men like Littlefinger were forced to tread carefully. The High Sparrow had no tolerance for puppet masters who pulled strings for personal gain. Rumors abounded that Baelish had grown nervous and had retreated to Harrenhal. Some whispered he was forging alliances with the rebellious Lords Declarant, trying to stave off the Faith's influence. Cersei took no chances. She sent a letter to Robin Arryn, calling him to King's Landing for a visit, reminding him of the Vale's duty to the crown. But the Vale's suspicious regents refused. They claimed the boy's health was too fragile for such a journey. The High Sparrow's response was swift and rhetorical. Did the Vale's regents think themselves above the guidance of the Seven? A new wave of accusations sprung forth, claiming that those who kept the young lord away from the moral guidance of the faith must be secretly engaged in all manner of sin, greed, corruption, and worse. While the Vale's knights prepared for a possible confrontation, a rumor circulated that the Faith militant had discovered proof of illegal marriages, incestuous ties, and hidden bastards within the Vale's noblest families. Some said it was Qyburn's birds that concocted these rumors, feeding them to the High Sparrow's preachers. Others insisted that these tales were invented by the High Sparrow himself, a cunning means to justify an invasion. Regardless of the truth, the people believed. The banners of the Falcon might hold strong, but the Vale's small folk began to look to the Seven for deliverance from their distant lords. The alliance struck again, combining the Crown's men, bolstered by mercenaries newly hired under Qyburn's suggestion, with the Faith militant. They advanced upon the Bloody Gate, where the Vale's defenders had always been so formidable. But the High Sparrow had arranged for infiltration from within. Disgruntled peasants opened the gate under cover of darkness, letting the Faith's soldiers pour into the mountains. A swift campaign followed, with the local lords outmaneuvered by the combined forces. Baelish was nowhere to be found, rumored to have fled the Vale under false pretenses. The young Lord Arryn was taken into protective custody. Cersei herself visited the Eyrie once the fighting had ended, though her journey through those perilous mountain paths tested her nerve. She arrived to find the Vale's high seat quiet as a tomb. The boy lords sat in the Eyrie solar, wide-eyed and trembling, surrounded by grizzled faith militant guards. Cersei looked upon Robert Arryn and saw a quivering child with little sense of the world. He was frightened, starved for affection, and too ill to stand against the new power swirling around him. The High Sparrow insisted that the boy remain the nominal ruler, if only to maintain a semblance of continuity. But in truth, the Vale now answered to the faith. Any local lord who resisted faced swift condemnation. Many were stripped of titles, forced to pay heavy penance, or dragged to King's Landing in chains to face trial for heresy. With Dorne and the Vale brought to heel, the realm reverberated with shock. Cersei's new tyranny, supported and legitimized by the faith, seemed unstoppable. The small folk sometimes murmured against the severity of the new order, especially when men were put to the question for trifling accusations of sin, or when entire families were undone by a single rumor of treason. Still, the High Sparrow's preaching was relentless. Sin must be uprooted wherever it grew, lest the entire garden be choked by weeds. Cersei's argument was simpler for those who would listen. Obey your king, or face the penalty of law. The two messages overlapped, forging a realm that lived in thrall to both the throne and the Seven. In King's Landing, the tone changed. Bells tolled more often, calling the faithful to prayer. The streets were patrolled by men bearing both the royal lion sigil and the Star of the Faith. Gambling dens were closed, prostitutes driven out or forced to operate covertly. Drunkenness was punished with floggings. Even in the Red Keep, feasts became more subdued affairs, often preceded or followed by pious ceremonies. Cersei did not mind too much. She still enjoyed her private wine, and the High Sparrow knew better than to openly confront her own tastes. Their alliance depended on a certain tolerance, even if the High Sparrow disapproved of her personal indulgences. She, in turn, tolerated his incessant moralizing so long as it served her aims. A new wave of purges descended upon the crownlands. Houses suspected of disloyalty were stripped of lands and titles. Replacements, often from lesser families who had proven their faith and loyalty, were elevated. The crown's coffers swelled from confiscated properties, and the faith garnered praise for providing a semblance of equity. If a family was found guilty, their lands were redistributed to the worthy, not simply claimed by Cersei. Of course, the question of who was worthy fell to the faith's judgment, behind which Cersei's own will quietly guided decisions. A cunning synergy took shape. Cersei's enemies fell, and the High Sparrow's ideals found expression through the newly installed loyalists who owed their fortune to the faith. Meanwhile, on the other side of the continent, the North continued to grapple with its own struggles. Winter was looming, and rumors of unearthly threats beyond the wall still circulated, though few in King's Landing gave them any credence. House Stark, once nearly annihilated, had resurfaced in the form of Jon Snow, now king in the north, and his sister Sansa Stark, who had rallied the northern lords. They had driven out the Boltons and reclaimed Winterfell. How they might respond to Cersei's and the High Sparrow's new regime was uncertain. The North had its own gods, its own ways, and the faith of the Seven was weak in those lands. But for now, the North was too distant, too consumed with its own crises to challenge the crown. Riverrun, however, was another story. House Tully had tried to remain neutral through the chaos. Edmure Tully, once freed by Jaime Lannister only to be used as a bargaining chip, was living under precarious circumstances, stuck between his lingering loyalty to the Starks and the demands of the crown. When the faith began issuing edicts condemning those who supported traitorous uprisings, Edmure feared what might come next. The Tully name was already tarnished in King's Landing for their part in Robb Stark's rebellion, and Cersei had never forgiven the Tullys or the Starks for defying her family. In a series of letters, she demanded Edmure publicly swear fealty to King Tommen anew and embrace the faith of the Seven. She wanted him to repudiate the old alliances with the North, to stand firmly with the crown and the faith. But Edmure hesitated. Riverrun was his home, and he knew that bending the knee so completely might be a betrayal of everything House Tully stood for. The High Sparrow, incensed by this indecision, declared that the Tullys had always harbored sin, from Hoster Tully's rumored transgressions to the rebellious acts of Catelyn Stark. He insisted that Edmure prove his devotion by turning over all Stark sympathizers in the Riverlands, including any wandering knights, bannermen, or even small folk who still wore wolf emblems in secret. When Edmure requested more time, the High Sparrow issued a public condemnation from the steps of the Great September, proclaiming that all who hesitated in stamping out treachery were themselves complicit in it. That condemnation was a clarion call. The faith militant ready to march and many river lords, seeking to avoid the faith's wrath, scuttled to show their compliance. Cersei herself took an active role this time, dispatching Jaime to treat with the Tully lords. Jaime, torn by conflicting loyalties, his love for his sister and his own complicated sense of honor, traveled to Riverrun under the banner of peace. But the faith sent its own representative, a stern septa named Elisand, renowned for extracting confessions from the reluctant. The mere presence of the septa and her retinue of warrior sons set the Tully defenders on edge. Jaime's arrival was less threatening at first glance, but the Tully guards remembered all too well how he had once besieged Riverrun. He asked to speak with Edmure alone. In a small courtyard by the waters of the Red Fork they met. Edmure looked wan and anxious, his hair lank, his eyes shadowed by too many sleepless nights. Jaime wore his Lannister armor, polished to a bright sheen, though he had left his golden hand covered by a leather glove, avoiding the brash display. For a time, neither man spoke, each measuring the other. The wind carried a faint chill, and the gurgling of the river sounded almost ominous. Finally, Jaime broke the silence. Edmure, this doesn't have to end in bloodshed. My sister, Queen Cersei, merely wants your loyalty. The faith demands your penance. Give them what they want and keep your lands, your family safe. Edmure's throat worked, and he looked down at his boots. You know the Tully words, Jaime. Family, duty, honor. If I turn over my bannermen who once supported the Starks, I betray them. If I bow to the faith, I betray the old alliance. Tell me, which is the lesser betrayal? Jaime's eyes flicked with frustration. You speak of betrayal, but all the great houses in this realm have had to make choices to survive. If you stand against the crown, you'll lose everything, Edmure. The faith won't negotiate forever. They consider themselves above the petty politics of the realm. Edmure gave a hollow laugh. And do you truly believe that? Or is it just what your sister wants you to say? The faith is as political as any house. More so, perhaps, because they claim the moral high ground. They'll tear the Tully name apart if I don't comply. They will, Jaime admitted, voice tight. But compliance is simple. Give them a gesture. Purge your ranks of those who openly defied the crown. Publicly embrace the Seven. Let the small folk see that House Tully is devout and loyal. Then maybe they'll spare you. Edmure looked at the castle walls, where Tully banners drooped in the cool air. He thought of the men who followed him, men who had bled and died for causes they believed just. He thought of his uncle, Brynden the Blackfish, who had once been a thorn in the side of the Lannisters, always defiant. And he thought of how the realm had changed, how the old codes of honor seemed meaningless under the faith's absolute rule. He closed his eyes, releasing a slow breath. I will do what must be done to protect my son and my people, he said, trembling. But if your sister and the faith betray me after I do so, know that the Tully name won't go quietly into the night. Jaime nodded, a flicker of regret in his gaze. I'll make sure they don't push too far. You have my word, for whatever that's worth. The next day, Edmure bent the knee to King Tommen in a public ceremony, announcing his devotion to the Seven and his renunciation of any alliances with traitors or rebels. He handed over a list of knights and lords who had once fought for Robb Stark, some of whom still sheltered in the Riverlands. It was a grim, heart-wrenching act, but he believed it necessary. The faith's septa Elisand pronounced him absolved of sin, praising his righteous compliance. Jaime Lannister stood by, fighting the urge to show any outward sign of sympathy. A piece of Jaime felt hollow, knowing that this humiliating capitulation for House Tully was orchestrated by Cersei and the High Sparrow. But there was no turning back the tide. Back in King's Landing, Cersei and the High Sparrow celebrated another victory. With the Riverlands brought to heel, only the Stormlands, the Reach, and the Iron Islands remained as significant powers. House Tyrell had been purged from the capital, but the Reach was still vast and wealthy. Yet the hearts and minds in the Reach had been shaken. The official stance was uncertain. Randyll Tarly, once pledged to the Tyrells, was rumored to be forging a path independent of them, deeply resentful that Mace Tyrell had led them into a humiliating fall. House Hightower in Old Town, seat of the Faith, was openly allied with the High Sparrow. This made the region ripe for further infiltration. The Stormlands, under the remnants of House Baratheon or their distant relatives, had never fully recovered from the losses of Renly and Stannis. Gendry, the rumored bastard of King Robert, had no official standing, despite whispered rumors that the Faith might legitimize him if it served their cause. The Iron Islands, ruled now by Queen Yara, were distant, their seas rough, and their faith belonging to the drowned god, not the Seven. Tensions simmered between the Ironborn and the new regime in King's Landing. But as these conflicts brewed, the realm slowly adapted to Cersei's and the High Sparrow's reign of piety and power. The common folk, who had once jeered Cersei in her Walk of Atonement, now found themselves gazing upon her in a strange mixture of awe and dread. She was the Queen Mother, the woman who had atoned for her sins and emerged as a champion of the faith. She walked the halls of the Red Keep with unshakable composure, wearing dresses that combined Lannister crimson with discreet symbols of the Seven. Her golden hair, once a flowing mane, was kept shorter, a silent nod to the memory of her humiliation. The High Sparrow, for his part, walked among the poor barefoot, wearing the same tattered robes as always. But beneath that humble exterior lay a will of iron. He had become more than a shepherd of souls. He was a kingmaker, bending the realm's nobility through confession and condemnation. On a brisk morning, they convened again in the Red Keep. The High Sparrow, despite his numerous new duties, still kept close contact with Cersei, for each needed the other's support to maintain the precarious balance of fear and reverence that held the city in check. They met in a small courtyard at dawn, away from prying ears. The High Sparrow had asked for a private audience. A light fog clung to the edges of the yard, softening the silhouettes of the stone walls and the towering keep. "I must speak to you about the next phase," he said, his voice gentle but firm. Cersei folded her hands before her. "I'm listening. The houses that remain, Tarly in the Reach, Baratheon kin in the Stormlands, and Greyjoy in the Iron Islands. We must ensure their loyalty and root out their sins. Already we have seen them waver. Randyll Tarly will not bow to a puppet king or queen, but he might bow to the faith if we approach him carefully. He's a devout man, known for his discipline." Cersei tilted her head. "Are you proposing negotiations with Tarly before we condemn him? He's an arrogant man, if I recall. He is, but also pragmatic. If we convince him that the Tyrells were false stewards of the Reach's morality, he might join us willingly. In exchange, we give him rightful overlordship of the region, provided he swears fealty to King Tommen and upholds the faith's edicts." Cersei considered the notion. So Tarly would become the new warden of the South. That would remove the last vestige of Tyrell influence and bring the Reach under our command. "Indeed. And the Stormlands?" The High Sparrow continued. "That region stands weakened. If they resist, we will do what we have done elsewhere. But if they submit, they might retain their lands. As for the Iron Islands," he paused, a flicker of distaste crossing his features, "their worship of the drowned god is heretical. They shall either convert or face condemnation." A faint smile touched Cersei's lips. "Let them face condemnation. They've been a nuisance to the Seven Kingdoms for generations. We can worry about them last. The seas are difficult for the faith militant to navigate, but they can't hold out forever." There was a moment of silence, broken only by the soft sound of a raven taking flight from a nearby perch. Then the High Sparrow spoke again, more quietly. Our alliance has brought much change to these lands. But you know as well as I do that not all the changes are wholeheartedly embraced. The small folk whisper of tyranny, of fear. I must ensure that what we build endures beyond our lifetimes. Cersei stiffened. What are you suggesting? That Tommen, in the fullness of time, might produce heirs who are raised devout. The realm needs a pious king or queen to continue this course. And with each year that passes, the faithful become more entrenched. If we are to endure, we cannot waver. Cersei's face darkened momentarily. The mention of Tommen producing heirs was a reminder of all that was lost and uncertain. But she swallowed her bitterness. Tommen will do as he is told. He understands his duty. The High Sparrow inclined his head, seeming satisfied. Very well. Let us ensure the houses that remain are brought to the light of the seven, or cast aside. Within a fortnight, a delegation of the faith militant rode to Horn Hill, accompanied by a crown emissary. They carried an offer for Randyll Tarly. Denounce House Tyrell and all others who once betrayed the crown, swear absolute devotion to King Tommen and the faith, and be granted the title Warden of the South. In a show of sincerity, the High Sparrow penned a letter personally, praising Tarly's military prowess and lamenting the moral downfall of the Tyrells. Tarly, always proud, resented Mace Tyrell for squandering the Reach's reputation through political machinations in King's Landing. The news that Marjorie, Loras, and Mace were languishing in dungeons or had fled in disgrace seemed to confirm that House Tyrell's star had fallen. Tarly, shrewd as ever, recognized an opportunity. When Tarly met the Faith's envoys, he did so in the Grand Hall of Horn Hill, a stately structure adorned with trophies of his hunts and battles. He wore a stern expression, well aware that the eyes of the realm were upon him now. He despised bending the knee to a woman he considered manipulative and cunning, but in the new order, practicality reigned. If he refused, the faith would brand him a heretic or traitor, and Horn Hill would be swept into the same devastation that had befallen others. He had a family to protect, a legacy to uphold. He agreed to the terms, albeit with a stiff nod. The faith's envoys led a prayer in the hall, commanding Tarly and his household to join them. Randyll bowed his head. He did not particularly relish the idea of kneeling to any power beyond his own mastery of warfare, but as the High Sparrow had calculated, Tarly's sense of duty and discipline overrode his pride. He prayed along with them, accepted the star pin that signified his alliance with the faith, and vowed to enforce the moral dictates of the Seven throughout the Reach. In King's Landing, news of Tarly's submission was greeted with satisfaction by Cersei. She promptly had a new royal patent drawn up, naming him Warden of the South. The effect was immediate. The smaller houses in the Reach that had wavered now saw a stable power in Tarly, approved by the Crown and the Faith. They bent the knee in turn, eager to avoid the purges that had claimed so many other families. The High Sparrow praised their devotion, encouraging them to purge the region of any lingering Tyrell loyalists or unrepentant sinners. In short order, the Reach fell in line, driven by a combination of fear, fervor, and opportunism. As each region submitted, Cersei's power grew. Her nights became easier. She slept soundly, haunted less by the memories of her Walk of Atonement and more by the vision of a unified realm under her child's rule. Sometimes she would stand at her balcony overlooking Blackwater Bay and imagine a future in which every ship bore the sigil of House Lannister or the Star of the Faith, in which no one dared speak of rebellion or challenge the throne. She found that the piece of her that once worried about prophecy, about the Valonqar coming to end her life, had quieted. Her foes were bowing one by one, and she had the might of the faith behind her. It was as if the very gods now stood by her side. But beyond the capital's walls, discontent bubbled. The harsh enforcement of the faith's codes, the forced conversions or humiliating arrests, and the fanatical mania of the warrior sons grated upon those who still remembered a freer, if more chaotic, time. Whispers circulated that certain lords were secretly gathering their strength, forging alliances to overthrow what they called the new tyranny. Some pinned their hopes on Daenerys Targaryen, rumored to be across the sea with her dragons, though no confirmed sightings had reached the capital. Others turned their gaze northward, to Winterfell and the rumored king in the north, hoping that if the Faith tried to force the old gods out of the north, the region might rise in bloody defiance. Still, for the moment, the alliance seemed unstoppable. The Stormlands fell next, more from exhaustion than anything else. The Lesser Lords remembered the horrors of war under Stannis and Renly, and they had no appetite for resisting this new, unstoppable tide. They declared for Tommen and welcomed the Faith's presence, even if privately they grumbled about the new moral strictures. Anyone who dared speak up faced quick retribution. Charges of heresy or moral corruption, or any sin that the Faith could fabricate. It was enough to keep them docile. When word finally reached Cersei that the Iron Islands had entered open rebellion, Yara Greyjoy refused to submit to the Faith, refusing to abandon the drowned god. Cersei and the High Sparrow prepared for a campaign across the sea. The royal fleet, bolstered by new ships commissioned from the Arbor under Tarly's supervision, set sail from King's Landing. Leading the Faith's contingent was a fanatical septon named Maribald, who preached that the drowned god was a demonic entity and must be eradicated from the Isles. The Faith militant found the Ironborn to be more than they had bargained for. The seas were harsh, the Iron Fleet formidable. Yara and her captains ambushed them repeatedly, inflicting stinging losses. Cersei had hoped to see the Iron Islands crushed swiftly, but the campaign dragged on. Sporadic battles erupted among the waves, neither side gaining a decisive advantage. Ironborn raiders landed on the coasts of the Westerlands, harrying Lannister settlements in retaliation. Bitter months ensued, with no quick victory in sight. Meanwhile, the rest of the realm settled into an uneasy peace under the joint rule of the Crown and the Faith. The great houses had been either subdued, destroyed, or co-opted. Trials and purges continued, but at a slower pace. Many lords who initially recoiled from this strict order now found ways to profit from it, especially if they publicly supported the Faith's zeal. The economy struggled under the constant threat of religious interference, but for the common folk, there was a sense of guarded stability. Crime in King's Landing was down, mostly because any offense, however minor, could lead to severe punishment. People prayed more, in fear if not in genuine devotion. Statues of the Seven replaced many older local shrines. Morality became both a weapon and a shield. All the while, Cersei garnered a fearsome reputation as the queen who had mastered the High Sparrow. No longer a mere manipulator behind the throne, she was the public face of the monarchy, enforcing its will hand in hand with the Faith. She personally presided over the condemnation of any who dared speak ill of the regime. Her cunning shaped the purges to her advantage, ensuring that House Lannister's place at the pinnacle of power remained unassailable. One day, in the halls of the Red Keep, she found herself face-to-face with Lady Olenna Tyrell, who had avoided capture but had returned to King's Landing under a banner of truce. The once formidable Queen of Thorns was frilier now, her family shattered, her fortune seized. Yet her eyes still gleamed with unbowed spirit as she confronted Cersei in a deserted corridor. The Faith had granted her a temporary audience to plead for the lives of a few distant relatives who had not yet been arrested. She had just met with the High Sparrow and was leaving when she crossed paths with Cersei. "So," Lady Olenna said, voice as sharp as ever, "you've managed to do it. You and that barefoot fanatic have knocked every other house off the board, more or less." Cersei regarded her coolly. "We've cleansed the realm. Your house, it seems, was found wanting." Olenna gave a bitter chuckle. "Spare me the sanctimony. We both know this is about power, not piety. You might dress it up in the Faith's rags, but it's the same old game, isn't it?" Cersei's lips curled. "Call it what you will. Your time is over. House Tyrell is finished." Lady Olenna stepped closer, raising a gnarled finger. "No, I am finished. House Tyrell may rise again or it may not. But you, Cersei Lannister, you've let that fanatical vulture into your nest. You think you can control him, but I've lived long enough to see men like him. Sooner or later, they turn on the hand that feeds them. And when he does, you'll wish you had burned that sept to the ground when you had the chance." Cersei's eyes flared with anger. "Take her away," she snapped at the guards trailing behind. Olenna offered no resistance as they escorted her down the hall, her scathing words lingering in Cersei's thoughts. In the great September of Baelor later that day, Cersei approached the High Sparrow. Sunlight poured through the stained glass windows, casting rainbow hues on the marble floor. She felt momentarily disquieted by Olenna's accusation that she might be the next one purged. But she quelled the thought. Their alliance was ironclad, bound by their mutual interests. If the High Sparrow tried to turn on her, he would lose his foothold in the monarchy. She reminded herself of how carefully she had orchestrated this arrangement. She was indispensable. Tommen was the living symbol of their unity. No, there was no threat. The High Sparrow sensed her tension as she entered. He walked toward her, his hands folded. "Your Grace, is something amiss? Lady Olenna?" Cersei began, her tone clipped. "Dares to come here, to beg for some petty mercy, and then insults our sacred alliance. She is a woman of sharp tongue and sharper regrets. Pay her no heed." The High Sparrow replied calmly. Cersei nodded, exhaling slowly. "She says you will turn on me eventually, that the Faith is as greedy for power as anyone." The High Sparrow's expression was mild, but the lines around his mouth tightened a fraction. "I serve the Seven, Your Grace, as do my followers. That devotion guides us. You and I share a goal, a realm free of sin and treachery. I will not betray that cause." She studied him for a moment, searching for any flicker of deceit. But his demeanor remained steady. A sense of wary reassurance settled upon her. "Then we have nothing further to discuss," she said, and departed the sept without another word, her footsteps echoing in the grand chamber. Seasons shifted, and rumors of winter grew more urgent. From the north came unsettling tidings of white ravens flying from the citadel, signaling the official start of the cold season. In the capital, the Faith redoubled its calls for the people to keep watch over their souls. The city's squares rang with proclamations that only piety would protect the realm from the darkness ahead. The king, Tommen, grew older but still seemed overshadowed by his mother and the High Sparrow. Occasionally, Cersei saw confusion or dismay in his eyes when confronted with some act of cruelty by the Faith militant. Yet he did nothing, hampered by fear of losing his mother's approval and the High Sparrow's blessing. Beyond the city, quiet rebellions flared in pockets. Here and there, a sept was burned. Faith militant traveling the roads vanished, rumored to have been ambushed by outlaws. But these minor sparks never ignited into a full blaze. The crown and the Faith were too entrenched, too swift to crush dissent. A chilling hush fell over the land, as though the entire realm was bracing for a winter not just of cold, but of absolute rule. Then, at the turn of the year, word reached the capital from the citadel in Old Town, an urgent request to the crown, seeking cooperation in matters of higher learning and the distribution of knowledge regarding the coming winter. Cersei cared little for the maester's dryness, but the High Sparrow insisted on sending a faithful delegation to ensure that the knowledge circulated by the citadel remained pious. This sparked tension with the archmaesters, who prided themselves on their neutrality. But the Faith was no longer content to let such institutions remain outside its influence. Old Town was a stronghold of the Faith, yet the citadel had always insisted on independence. For the High Sparrow, that independence had become an affront. In a series of letters, the High Sparrow challenged the citadel's tradition of sending maesters to serve houses regardless of their moral standing. He pressed them to recall any maesters serving lords who had been declared sinners or traitors, effectively dismantling the neutral chain of service. Archmaester Ambrose replied with carefully worded arguments, citing centuries of tradition, reminding the High Sparrow that knowledge was not sin. But the Faith pressed on, leading to a standoff in Old Town. The city became a battleground of rhetoric and threat, with the Starry September's influence pressing against the citadel's autonomy. Cersei took a more pragmatic view. The citadel was valuable for its knowledge. She did not want the maesters entirely subjugated, fearing it might hamper the realm's ability to cope with winter or future wars. But the High Sparrow's zeal was difficult to temper. She found herself in the strange position of trying to protect an institution she had previously despised, purely because it was necessary for governance. Eventually, a compromise was reached. The citadel would voluntarily recall any maester who served a house declared traitor by the crown, but it would remain neutral in all other respects. The High Sparrow accepted this grudgingly, believing it to be a step in the right direction. Such frictions revealed small fault lines in the alliance. From time to time, Cersei recognized that the High Sparrow had his own agenda that did not always align perfectly with her pragmatic needs. Still, the bond held. They had come too far, purged too many, and reshaped the realm's governance to turn on each other now. In King's Landing, the crowning achievement of their reign thus far stood in the form of a new structure adjoining the Great September. A grand hall for the Faith's courts, where moral and treasonous accusations alike were heard. Cersei had overseen its construction personally, funneling confiscated wealth into the project. Inside, intricately carved pillars depicted scenes from the seven-pointed star, and a towering statue of the mother loomed over the central dais, symbolizing mercy but also silent judgment. A separate statue of the warrior stood guard at the entrance, his sword pointed downward as though to warn any who would disrupt the proceedings. It was in this hall that men and women of all stations came to be judged, a display of unity between crown and faith. Yet it was also in this hall that Cersei occasionally spied a glimpse of the High Sparrow's true power. She watched him preside over cases, listened to his measured voice call for confessions, heard him sentence lords to ruin for the slightest hint of defiance. He never raised his tone, never sneered or gloated, but there was an inescapable finality in his words. She saw in him a reflection of her own ruthlessness, a relentless pursuit of his vision, unyielding in the face of any plea for mercy or compromise that did not align with his beliefs. And she wondered, in rare moments of unease, what he would do if ever he deemed her unfit. But she reassured herself that day would never come. She was the mother of the king, the queen regent in all but name, and she had walked the path of atonement. The High Sparrow needed her as much as she needed him. They were two sides of the same coin, pride and piety, each feeding the other's influence. And so the purges continued. Rivals vanished, entire houses withered, and the small folk bowed their heads in prayer, uncertain whether they should fear or embrace this new order. Some found solace in the peace that settled over most of the realm. Banditry was down, local disputes were often settled quickly by traveling faith justiciars, and war had largely ceased outside of the Iron Islands conflict. Others lamented the stranglehold on personal freedoms, the stifling moral laws that turned neighbors into informants. Yet day by day, the grip of the crown and the faith tightened, and there was no clear champion to oppose them. Seasons wore on. The nights grew longer and colder. In King's Landing, the air was brisk off the bay, carrying a chill that made citizens wrap themselves in thicker cloaks. The rains came more frequently, soaking the cobblestone streets. The Great September stood like a beacon on Visigna's hill, its statues illuminated by torches against the gray skies. Cersei found a kind of cold comfort in the knowledge that her enemies lay dead or scattered. The Tyrells, the Martells, the Arryns, and so many others had all bent or broken. If the realm was to face winter, at least it did so under the iron guidance of her family and the unwavering faith. Late one evening, she returned to her chambers and allowed herself the indulgence of a hot bath, courtesy of the few remaining servants not dismissed or repurposed by the faith. As she sank into the steaming water, she recalled a memory from years past. Her father, Tywin Lannister, lecturing her on the nature of power. He had taught her that power came from gold, from alliances, from fear. She had once thought cunning alone would secure her place. Now she realized she had found an even stronger foundation, a righteous cause that the masses believed in. The High Sparrow had given her that cause. Without him, she would have remained entangled in constant political struggles. With him, she had become unstoppable, or so it seemed. But as the water lapped against her skin, she felt a tiny pang of doubt, echoing Olenna Tyrell's warning. She dismissed it again, as she always did. Yet deep in her mind, she could not entirely banish the question. What if the High Sparrow judged her wanting? What if, one day, Tommen's legitimacy or her own sins became too great a burden for him to ignore? She clenched her fists beneath the water, pushing the thought away. The alliance was too strong. Their goals were too aligned. The next morning, she rose and dressed in garments of black and gold, the color scheme that had become her signature, accented subtly by a small seven-pointed star embroidered at the cuff, an unmistakable gesture of unity with the faith. She went to break her fast with Tommen, who seemed gloomier than usual. She stroked his hair and tried to offer some reassurance, but his eyes were distant. The faith's demands and the role of kingship had taken their toll on him. He was no longer the bright, innocent child she remembered. He had grown quieter, more inward. The pressures of the throne and the relentless moral scrutiny had hardened him in ways she had not foreseen. Yet he was still malleable, still under her sway. Afterwards, she joined the High Sparrow in a council meeting. There, they reviewed updates from the maesters about the severity of the upcoming winter, the minimal progress in subduing the Iron Islands, and the persistent rumors of Daenerys Targaryen's growing strength across the sea, rumors that now came with tales of dragons being used in skirmishes around Slaver's Bay. The High Sparrow listened carefully, his expression showing no fear, only resolve. He spoke calmly of the need for greater unity, for more prayer, for the realm to stand together under one faith in the event that Targaryen power came knocking. Cersei, for her part, dismissed the Targaryen threat in public, though privately she remembered the wildfire that lay hidden beneath the city, the destructive power once used during the Battle of Blackwater Bay. If a dragon ever soared over King's Landing, she was prepared to do the unthinkable to protect her rule. The High Sparrow, perhaps sensing her hidden determination, offered no mention of wildfire or the old rumors about caches planted by Aerys II Targaryen. Their meeting concluded with mutual agreement. They would remain vigilant. Daenerys could wait, as long as the realm was steadfast in its faith. Weeks turned to months, and the grip of winter tightened. Snow fell in the southern parts of the realm, an unusual sight, causing small folk and lords alike to cluster around hearths. In King's Landing, the wind off the bay cut like a knife. Fires were lit in every chamber of the Red Keep, and the city's poor huddled in the streets, reliant on the faith's charity to survive. The High Sparrow's pious distribution of bread and soup gave him an even stronger bond with the lower classes. Cersei watched from the windows, seeing how the starving masses praised the High Sparrow for the meager sustenance. That praise, inevitably, spilled over to King Tommen, the boy king who had united the realm under the Seven. It might have been a triumph, had the travails of winter not exacerbated every tension. The unyielding laws of the faith became harder to bear as resources grew scarce. People grew desperate, tempers flared, and where once the faith militant might have flogged a thief, now they might cut off a hand or sentence them to hard labor in the newly established penal camps. Whispers of unrest multiplied, but fear of punishment kept them mostly subdued. The realm existed in a quiet oppression, lulled by the High Sparrow's endless sermons about unity and the greater good. In that hush, no one noticed immediately when petty lords began to band together in the western hills, claiming they could no longer endure the faith's tyranny. Their efforts were small, scattered, but it was a sign. The realm was not as docile as it appeared. Cersei met the rumor with an iron fist, dispatching crown forces and faith militant to stamp out any sign of organized rebellion. By and large, they succeeded, dispersing or imprisoning the would-be rebels. Yet the fact that such an uprising had begun at all gave Cersei a moment of pause. She conferred with Qyburn, who hinted that discontent was spreading among certain nobility who had lost too much power. It was at this juncture that the High Sparrow proposed yet another wave of purges, targeting those who had harbored disloyalty or heretical thoughts. He planned to intensify confessions, to root out any who might betray the cause. Cersei considered his request carefully. Too much purging could fuel a larger rebellion, but not purging enough could let the seeds of sedition grow. Together, they decided to proceed with caution. The faith's men would conduct inquiries, seeking out rumored traitors, but only act decisively when evidence was sufficient. This was, of course, a relative standard. They could declare a rumor to be sufficient evidence if needed. Still, Cersei preferred a more strategic approach these days. She wanted no single spark that could explode into open revolt. In the end, the measures worked for the moment. The uneasy peace continued. A taut thread stretched across the kingdom, held together by fear, faith, and an unrelenting winter that sapped everyone's strength. If House Stark in the north had thoughts of challenging the new regime, they gave no sign of it. War with the undead, some claimed, was brewing beyond the wall, occupying the North's attention. Daenerys Targaryen, rumored to be mustering forces in Essos, had yet to set foot on Westerosi soil. And so, day by day, the power of Cersei and the High Sparrow remained unchallenged. Each morning, as Cersei awoke in her grand yet somehow austere chambers, she would run her fingers over the polished wooden bedposts, remembering a time when her life was guided by one ambition: to see her children crowned and her enemies destroyed. Now, Tommen sat on the throne, albeit overshadowed by her and by the High Sparrow, and most of her enemies were indeed destroyed or driven away. She had achieved what she once thought impossible. And yet, the sense of triumph was tempered by the cold, by the hush of fear throughout the castle, by the knowledge that she was forever bound to a zealot's cause. She would rise, dress, and make her way to the throne room where Tommen would preside over the day's audiences. She would stand behind him, a living shadow, occasionally whispering instructions. The High Sparrow would be in attendance too, conferring his blessing on the king's decrees. Nobles, merchants, and supplicants would bring their pleas or disputes. Some asked for leniency from the faith's moral strictures. Few received it. Others brought news of minor rebellions or offered tributes as proof of loyalty. Cersei would weigh each case, letting the High Sparrow pronounce the moral verdict while she dictated the realm's practical response. It was a duet of power, each note carefully measured. Over time, the lines between the crown's authority and the faith's moral edicts blurred until they were almost indistinguishable. A cunning lord might say, "By the king's law I must pay my taxes, but by the faith's law I must forswear my worldly ambitions. How am I to reconcile the two?" And the High Sparrow would respond, "Pay your taxes to your rightful king, then distribute your surplus in charity to the poor. Seek not to enrich yourself, but to serve the realm. In that way you obey both crown and the seven." And so it went, the entire realm locked in a cycle of fear-driven piety. Months passed into years. Tommen grew into young manhood under the faith's watchful eye. He confessed daily, performed public ceremonies of devotion. He even took to wearing a seven-pointed star upon his breastplate. Cersei watched with a mix of pride and unease as he evolved into a gentle but deeply devout king. He believed wholly in the faith's message, in the partnership that had brought peace and stability to his lands. He seldom spoke out against any cruelty or ruthlessness inflicted by the faith militant. Instead, he prayed for the souls of the condemned and trusted in the High Sparrow's guidance. Cersei found it unsettling how thoroughly he had been shaped, yet recognized it as the cost of holding power. Tommen was no Joffrey, no violent tyrant. He was something more insidiously malleable, a devout ruler who believed everything was justified if it served the seven. Whenever Cersei found herself unsettled by her son's complete faith, she would recall how vulnerable he had once seemed, how a single push from Margaery Tyrell or the Tyrells' allies could have turned him against her. Now that danger was gone. He was hers and also the High Sparrow's, though that fact spurred a flicker of jealousy in her. In quiet moments, she wondered if she might lose Tommen's love to the High Sparrow's spiritual hold. But she always reminded herself that blood was thicker than water, or soup kitchens and silent prayers. She was his mother, and that would never change. Yet each day, new confessions, new arrests. The realm's moral code grew ever more suffocating. Cersei heard less laughter in the Red Keep, fewer merrymakers in the streets. Instead, there was the ever-present sound of bells and prayers, the hush of cold winds. The proud banners of purged houses were replaced with the Star of the Faith or the Lion of House Lannister. In the corridors, Qyburn's whispers grew anxious. He told Cersei that the realm was stable now but also stagnant. Trade had decreased, harvests suffered under the cold, and the people grew weary. Tensions might erupt if conditions did not improve. Cersei weighed these warnings, uncertain how to balance the demands of survival with the demands of the faith. The High Sparrow's stance was unwavering. In times of hardship, the people must cling to their faith all the more fervently. Let them pray for deliverance. Let them purge themselves of the sins that had led to these trials. Winter was God's test, an opportunity to prove piety and obedience. Cersei recognized the danger in letting so many starve or freeze while devoting resources to the faith's expansions. But she also recognized the High Sparrow's frightening influence over the masses. If she openly opposed him, the faithful might turn on her. Instead, she orchestrated token relief efforts, ensuring that minimal resources were distributed to quell the worst of the unrest, while continuing to support the faith's broader agenda. Over time, the structure they built began to show cracks. Minor revolts flared. The Ironborn refused to bend. Daenerys Targaryen loomed in the east with uncertain timing. The north remained ominously silent. And within King's Landing, the small folk vacillated between grateful dependence on the faith's charity and frightened resentment of its iron rule. Yet, for the moment, no single challenge was strong enough to topple the alliance. Cersei's hold, aided by the High Sparrow's fanaticism, was secure. And so the Seven Kingdoms stumbled forward under this dark harmony of regal authority and religious fervor. The bells tolled daily, summoning the devout to kneel in the Great September or in the smaller septs throughout the city. The faith militant patrolled the streets in disciplined formations, while the gold cloaks watched from a slight distance, overshadowed and outnumbered. The might of House Lannister underscored every decree, ensuring that even the proudest lord hesitated before challenging the crown's proclamations. Tommen, gentle and devout, reigned from the Iron Throne, but behind him stood the imposing specter of his mother and the High Sparrow, a unity that had reshaped the very landscape of power. In that hush, in the prayers and the quiet terror, one could stand upon the walls of the Red Keep on a cold, gray afternoon and survey a city that seemed almost serene. The winding streets, the distant sails in the bay, the ring of mountains in the far horizon. If one did not listen too carefully, one might believe that peace had at last settled upon Westeros. But in truth, it was merely the calm eye of a storm, a hush enforced by the faith's intolerance and the crown's thirst for supremacy. Beneath the surface, the storm raged on, waiting for its time to break. Cersei, standing at that vantage point, might let the chill wind whip through her short golden hair. She might recall all the faces of those who had wronged her, all the humiliations and tragedies she had endured, and feel a savage satisfaction that now she had outlived or destroyed them all. She had joined with the High Sparrow to purge the realm of every threat, every rival. And it had worked, too well perhaps, but it had worked. House Lannister reigned supreme, hand in hand with the Seven, an uneasy marriage of convenience and belief. What came next was a question only the gods could answer. Winter's chill had settled, the realm's power consolidated. Some dreamed of spring, a time when the land might flourish again, and the old ways might find resurgence. Others believed the realm would never recover from this era of purges and fanaticism, that the Seven Kingdoms would remain locked in the grip of faith-driven tyranny forever. As for Cersei Lannister, the queen who had knelt in shame and risen in power, she kept her secrets close, her alliances closer, and her enemies beneath the ground. And so the realm continued, day by day, held in the iron clasp of crown and sept, fear and devotion. Every sunrise brought fresh confessions, each sundown a new sin uncovered. Winter gripped the land in its cold embrace, echoing the hearts of those who ruled without mercy. The future lay hidden in the stillness of the night, where the faint sounds of distant winds carried whispers of rebellion or redemption, or something far darker waiting just beyond mortal sight. But within the city, beneath the towering presence of the Great September of Baelor, two figures stood at the apex of power: Cersei Lannister, Queen Mother, and the High Sparrow, Shepherd of the Faith. Together, they had purged the Seven Kingdoms of any who dared oppose them, forging a realm bound by fear and devotion, united in name if not in spirit. For the moment, that was enough.